The snowstorm outside howled like a relentless beast, its icy fingers clawing at the windows of 42-year-old Sarah Harper's lakeside cabin in Vermont. Inside, Sarah sat curled in an armchair, a worn novel in one hand and a steaming cup of tea in the other. The fire in the stone hearth flickered, its warmth a welcome reprieve from the bitter cold. The blizzard had trapped her here for days, and though she welcomed the solitude, the isolation had begun to weigh on her. Then it came a faint, desperate scratching at the door. Sarah frowned, setting her book and tea aside. She paused, straining to listen over the howling wind. There it was again, followed by a soft, pitiful whimper. Her heart quickened as she rose, her wool socks brushing against the hardwood floor. When she reached the door, she peered through the frosted glass and froze. Outside, barely visible through the swirling snow, stood a German shepherd, her body trembling violently in the freezing wind. Pressed against her side were two tiny puppies, their fragile forms almost hidden beneath the growing drifts of snow. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. The mother dog's fur was matted with ice, her ribs stark against her thin body. Yet, her eyes pleading, desperate, and full of determination were locked onto Sarah's. "Where did you come from?" Sarah murmured. She hesitated, her hand hovering over the doorknob. Letting them in would mean taking on a responsibility she wasn't sure she was ready for. But as the shepherd nudged one of her shivering pups closer, Sarah knew she couldn't turn them away. The wind hit her like a slap as she cracked the door open, its icy breath seeping into the cabin. "Come on, girl," Sarah coaxed, her voice soft and steady. "It's safe here." The shepherd didn't move at first, her body tense, her eyes darting between Sarah and her pups. Then, as if sensing Sarah's sincerity, she nudged one puppy forward with her nose. The tiny creature stumbled, its legs barely able to carry it through the snow. Without hesitation, the mother picked it up gently by the scruff and stepped inside, followed closely by the second pup. Sarah quickly shut the door, blocking out the storm's unrelenting fury. The warmth of the cabin enveloped them, but the shepherd trembled even more as her body adjusted to the sudden change in temperature. Her pups huddled close, their tiny bodies shivering uncontrollably. "Let's get you warm," Sarah murmured, grabbing an old quilt from the back of the couch. She draped it over the shepherd, who let out a low whimper but didn't shy away. The pups buried themselves beneath the blanket, their small cries fading as they began to relax. Sarah knelt beside them, her heart breaking at their frail appearance. The mother's eyes met hers again, this time filled with a mix of gratitude and exhaustion. "You've been through hell, haven't you?" Sarah whispered, reaching out tentatively. The shepherd flinched but didn't pull away as Sarah gently stroked her head. In the kitchen, Sarah warmed some broth, knowing the dogs needed nourishment. She set a shallow bowl on the floor, and the shepherd sniffed it cautiously before lapping at the liquid. Her pups followed suit, their tiny tongues dipping into the warmth. Watching them, Sarah felt an unexpected warmth rise in her chest, a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in years. The storm continued to rage outside, but inside, the cabin had become a sanctuary. The fire crackled softly, the room filled with the faint sounds of the pups breathing as they drifted into sleep. The shepherd settled beside them, her body relaxing for the first time. Sarah sat on the floor, her back against the couch, and watched them. She didn't know where they'd come from or what horrors they'd faced, but she knew one thing for certain: they were safe now. And so was she. Before, progress, Jack thought. "Good morning," he said softly, keeping his voice low to avoid startling her. The pups let out tiny squeaks as they nuzzled closer to their mother, their fragile forms a stark reminder of how vulnerable they were. Jack stood and stretched, the stiffness in his back a small price to pay for the peace he had found in the presence of these resilient creatures. He moved quietly to the kitchen and prepared some scrambled eggs and a small bowl of milk. He wasn't sure if it was the right meal for a dog, let alone one that had endured what this German shepherd had, but it was all he had on hand. Returning to the living room, he placed the food near the fire, stepping back to give her space. The shepherd lifted her head, her nose twitching as she sniffed the air. She eyed Jack briefly, her gaze softer than before, then leaned forward to lap at the milk. Jack noticed the pups beginning to stir, their tiny mouths opening and closing as if searching for nourishment. The mother instinctively shifted, guiding them to her side where they latched on and began nursing. Jack knelt down, watching the scene with a mix of awe and sadness. "You're a fighter, girl," he murmured, "but I can see you need help. We'll figure this out." The snow outside sparkled in the sunlight, a serene contrast to the turmoil the shepherd and her pups had faced. Jack grabbed his phone and searched for the nearest veterinary clinic. Living in the middle of nowhere had its advantages, but access to immediate resources wasn't one of them. The closest clinic was nearly an hour away, and with the storm having just cleared, the roads were likely treacherous. He glanced at the mother and her pups, weighing his options. They needed proper care, especially the mother, whose gaunt frame and visible exhaustion were concerning. Jack grabbed his coat and boots, then paused. "I'll be right back," he said, as if reassuring her. She lifted her head slightly, but made no move to stop him. Outside, the world was transformed. The storm had left behind a pristine landscape, the snow glittering under the clear blue sky. Jack cleared a path to his truck, the crunch of his boots breaking the stillness. Starting the engine, he let it idle to warm up while he went back inside. "Okay, girl," he said, crouching by the fire. "We're going for a ride. It's not going to be easy, but it's what you need." He wasn't sure how the mother would react to being moved, but he couldn't risk waiting. He grabbed a large blanket and gently approached her. "Easy now," he whispered. To his surprise, she didn't resist. She watched him warily but allowed him to wrap the blanket around her and the pups. Lifting them carefully, he carried them out to the truck, their combined weight lighter than he'd expected. The mother let out a soft whine, but the warmth of the blanket and Jack's steady hand seemed to calm her. The drive was slow and tense. The snow-covered roads were slippery, and every turn felt like a gamble. Jack kept glancing in the rearview mirror, where the shepherd lay in the back seat, her eyes fixed on him. The pups, tucked securely by her side, were quiet, their tiny breaths fogging the blanket. When they arrived at the clinic, Jack was greeted by a kind-faced veterinarian who immediately ushered them inside. The warmth of the building was a relief after the icy drive. The vet examined the mother and her pups, her expression a mix of concern and admiration. "She's malnourished and exhausted," the vet said, gently stroking the shepherd's head. "But her determination to protect these pups is remarkable. With care and proper nutrition, she'll recover." Hearing those words, Jack felt a weight lift from his chest. He stayed by the shepherd's side as the vet administered fluids and checked the pups. When it was time to leave, the vet handed him a bag of supplies and a reassuring smile. "You've given them a second chance." As Jack drove home, he glanced at the shepherd in the back seat. Her eyes met his, and for the first time, he saw a glimmer of trust. Back at the cabin, as the fire crackled and the pups nestled against their mother, Jack felt a deep sense of purpose. "You're safe now," he said softly. And as he watched them drift into a peaceful sleep, he knew his life had just changed forever. Curled protectively around her pups once again. Her eyes, though still wary, carried a softness that hadn't been there before. It was as if she was beginning to understand she was safe. Jack leaned back in his chair, exhaustion finally catching up to him after the whirlwind of the past 24 hours. "You're a fighter, girl," he murmured, almost to himself. "We'll get through this." The afternoon sunlight filtered through the cabin windows, illuminating the small space in a warm glow. Jack took the opportunity to tidy up and prepare a more permanent space for his unexpected guests. He set up an old crate filled with soft blankets near the fire, creating a cozy spot where the mother and her pups could rest. Every so often, he glanced at them, marveling at how they had endured so much and still clung to life with such determination. Later, as the day waned, Jack sat down with a notepad and began jotting down ideas. The vet had sent him home with clear instructions, high-quality food, regular checkups, and plenty of rest for the mother. Jack scribbled a list of supplies he needed to pick up in town. Dog food, puppy formula, a proper bed. He wanted to ensure they had everything they needed. As he worked, the sound of the pups' faint whimpers caught his attention. Looking over, he saw them wriggling against their mother, their tiny tails wagging with newfound energy. The sight brought a rare smile to his face. It had been a long time since Jack had felt this kind of warmth in his life. His retirement had been quiet, too quiet, if he was being honest. The cabin had become a refuge after years of chaos and trauma as a firefighter, but the isolation often left him feeling adrift. Now, with these dogs depending on him, Jack felt a renewed sense of purpose. As night fell, Jack prepared a simple dinner for himself and another warm meal for the German Shepherd. This time, she didn't hesitate to eat, her trust in him slowly growing. The pups, now full and content, had drifted off to sleep, their tiny bodies curled against their mother's side. Jack sat by the fire, the notebook forgotten on the table beside him. "You've got a name, don't you?" he asked the shepherd, his tone gentle. "We can't keep calling you girl. How about Hope?" "Yeah, that fits." The shepherd's ears perked slightly at the sound of his voice, and her tail gave the faintest wag. Jack chuckled softly. "Hope it is." The storm had left a serene stillness outside, the world blanketed in snow that glittered under the moonlight. Inside, the cabin felt like a sanctuary, the crackling fire casting dancing shadows across the walls. Jack leaned back in his chair, watching Hope and her pups as they slept. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. Hope's scars, both physical and emotional, would take time to heal, and the pups would need careful attention to thrive. But Jack was ready. The next morning, he woke to the sound of faint yips and the soft patter of paws on the wooden floor. Hope had risen and was nudging her pups gently, encouraging them to explore the room. Jack watched from his chair, a mug of coffee warming his hands as one of the pups waddled unsteadily toward him. It stopped at his feet, its tiny nose twitching as it sniffed curiously. "Well, good morning to you too," Jack said, setting the mug aside and reaching down to scoop up the pup. It fit perfectly in his hands, its small body warm and full of life. Hope watched him carefully but didn't protest. Instead, she settled down nearby, her eyes following every movement. Jack held the pup close, stroking its soft fur. "You've got your mom's spirit, little one," he said with a grin. As the days turned into weeks, the cabin transformed into a lively haven. Hope regained her strength, her coat growing glossy and her eyes brighter with each passing day. The pups thrived, their playful antics filling the once quiet cabin with joy. Jack found himself laughing more, the weight of his solitary life lifted by their presence. He knew they had a long journey ahead, but for the first time in years, Jack felt like he wasn't facing it alone. Hope and her pups had brought life back into his world, and in turn, he vowed to give them the love and care they deserve. Sometimes, he thought, life had a way of sending you exactly what you needed, even if it came wrapped in a snowstorm. With a cautious, yet undeniable warmth, her tail swishing lightly against the floor. Snow and Ash toddled behind her, their playful yips filling the air. Jack knelt down to scratch behind her ears, his grin broad and genuine. "You're becoming quite the welcoming committee," he chuckled, his voice filled with affection. Grace leaned into his hand, her eyes meeting his with a trust that hadn't been there weeks ago. It was as though she finally understood that this cabin, this man, and this life were hers to share. Jack hung his coat by the door and headed to the kitchen. The pups followed him, their tiny paws pattering on the wooden floor. Snow barked in excitement as Ash tried to climb up his leg, his little tail wagging furiously. Jack laughed, bending down to scoop them up. "You two are troublemakers," he said, holding them close. Their warm, wiggling bodies felt like a reminder of how far they had all come. Grace watched from the doorway, her posture relaxed but attentive. Jack set the pups down and turned to her. "Dinner time, girl," he said, grabbing a fresh bowl of kibble and placing it near the fire. Grace patted over, sniffing the bowl before eating with deliberate calmness. The pups joined her, each taking their place beside her as they nibbled on their smaller portions. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow through the cabin windows, Jack sat on the floor near the fire, watching his new family. Snow and Ash were playing tug-of-war with an old sock, their squeals of joy echoing through the room. Grace lay nearby, her head resting on Jack's knee, her eyes half closed in contentment. "You've turned this place upside down," Jack said, his voice soft. "And I couldn't be more grateful for it." That night, as the cabin settled into a peaceful quiet, Jack found himself reflecting on how much had changed. Grace's arrival had been unexpected, a moment of instinct that had altered the course of his life. The solitude he had once cherished now felt empty in hindsight. Grace and her pups had filled the cabin with warmth, laughter, and a sense of purpose he hadn't realized he was missing. The following morning, Jack woke to find the pups curled up beside him on the couch, their small bodies rising and falling with steady breaths. Grace was sitting by the window, watching the snow-covered world outside. Jack joined her, kneeling beside her and placing a hand on her back. "Thinking about where you came from?" he asked softly. "Wherever that was, you don't have to worry anymore. You're home now." Grace turned to him, her amber eyes holding a quiet understanding. Her tail wagged faintly, and Jack felt a lump rise in his throat. She trusted him completely now, and that trust was something he would never take for granted. Over the next few days, Jack began making plans to ensure their future. He called the vet for advice on long-term care and started gathering supplies to puppy-proof the cabin. The pups, meanwhile, grew bolder and more adventurous, turning every corner of the cabin into their personal playground. Jack couldn't stop smiling as he watched them, their joy infectious. One afternoon, Jack decided to take them outside for the first time since the storm. He bundled up and opened the door, leading Grace and the pups into the crisp winter air. Snow and Ash were hesitant at first, their tiny paws sinking into the powdery snow. But within moments, they were bounding around, their excited barks ringing out across the clearing. Grace stood watch, her tail wagging as she kept a careful eye on her pups. Jack stood back, leaning on the porch railing as he watched the scene unfold. The cabin, once a place of quiet retreat, now felt alive in a way he hadn't thought possible. Grace and her pups weren't just guests, they were family. As the sun dipped below the horizon and the sky turned shades of pink and orange, Jack called them back inside. Snow and Ash stumbled over each other as they raced toward the warmth of the cabin, Grace following close behind. That evening, as the fire crackled and the pups snuggled into their makeshift bed, Jack sat beside Grace, his hand resting gently on her back. "You've brought something special here," he said, his voice filled with gratitude. "And I'll do everything I can to keep you safe." Grace leaned into him, her eyes closing as if she understood. Together, they sat in the glow of the fire, the warmth of their newfound family filling the cabin with a light that no storm could ever extinguish. But saw nothing at first, just the dense forest and the shadows stretching long in the fading afternoon light. Still, the way Grace held her ground, her body taut and protective, sent a chill down his spine. Snow and Ash, sensing their mother's unease, scurried back to her side, their tiny forms pressing close. Jack reached for the small axe he had been using earlier, its reassuring weight grounding him. "What do you see, girl?" he murmured, his eyes scanning the tree line. A movement caught his attention, a fleeting shadow that disappeared as quickly as it came. His heart quickened. Grace barked sharply, her growl deepening. Jack stepped in front of her, shielding Snow and Ash instinctively. "Hey!" he called out, his voice firm but steady. "Who's there?" For a moment, the forest was silent, the only sound the faint rustle of leaves in the cold breeze. Then, a figure emerged from the shadows, their hands raised in a gesture of peace. It was a man bundled in a thick coat and scarf, his face partially obscured by a hood. His posture was non-threatening, but Jack's grip on the axe tightened. "Easy there," the man said, his voice calm but weary. "I'm not here to cause trouble." Jack didn't lower the axe. "Then what are you doing here?" The man sighed, lowering his hand slightly. "I'm looking for a dog. A German shepherd. She has 2 pups." His eyes flicked to Grace, who growled low in her throat, her body shielding the pups. Jack's gut twisted. "Why are you looking for her?" "She's mine," the man said, taking a cautious step forward. "Or at least, she was. She ran off during the storm." Grace let out a sharp bark, her stance unwavering. Jack glanced down at her, noticing the way her body trembled not with cold but with tension. He shook his head. "She doesn't look like she belongs to anyone. And judging by her condition when she showed up at my door, I'd say she's better off without whoever had her before." The man's expression hardened, but he didn't move closer. "You don't understand. I need her back. Those pups, they're valuable." Jack's blood ran cold at the word. Valuable? They're living creatures, not commodities. His voice was steel, his stance firm. The man's gaze darted between Jack and Grace. Look, I didn't mean it like that. I can't leave without them. Jack took a step forward, his grip tightening on the axe. You're going to have to. These dogs aren't going anywhere with you. The man hesitated, his jaw tightening. Grace barked again, stepping closer to Jack, her body a wall of defiance. The man seemed to weigh his options before stepping back into the shadows. You're making a mistake, he said, his voice carrying an edge. This isn't over. Jack stood his ground until the man disappeared into the forest. The tension lingered, the weight of the encounter pressing down on him. He turned to Grace, crouching to her level. You knew him, didn't you? He asked softly. Grace didn't respond, but her eyes spoke volumes, haunted, wary, and grateful all at once. Jack placed a hand on her head, his voice steady. I don't know what you've been through, but I promise you this, you're safe now. No one's taking you or your pups from here. As they made their way back to the cabin, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that trouble was far from over. He locked the door behind them, stoking the fire to chase away the chill that had settled in his chest. That evening, as Grace lay by the fire with her pups nestled against her, Jack sat nearby, deep in thought. The encounter had rattled him, but it had also solidified his resolve. Whatever Grace's past had been, it wasn't going to dictate her future, not while she was under his roof. Looking at her peaceful expression as she dozed, Jack made a silent vow. No matter what happens, he murmured, I'll protect you. All of you. The fire crackled softly, its warmth filling the room as the shadows of the past began to fade. But Jack knew that the battle to secure Grace's future and uncover the truth had only just begun. Was still out there, lurking in the shadows of the woods. Grace's occasional glances toward the windows, her ears perking at every faint sound, only deepened his unease. He tried to dismiss it as his imagination running wild, but something about her behavior suggested otherwise. She had seen or sensed something that wasn't going away. One crisp morning, as the sun broke through the frost-covered trees, Jack decided it was time to do more than just wait and worry. He bundled up and grabbed his old hunting rifle, more for comfort than necessity, and decided to walk the perimeter of his property. Grace watched him intently as he laced up his boots, her pups nestled close by. You stay here, Jack said firmly, crouching down to meet Grace's steady gaze. I'll check things out. Keep an eye on the little ones. Grace let out a low whine, her eyes filled with a mix of concern and reluctance. Jack gave her a reassuring pat on the head before stepping outside into the crisp winter air. The snow crunched under his boots as he made his way toward the tree line where Grace had been fixated days earlier. The forest was eerily quiet, the only sounds his own measured breaths and the occasional crack of a branch underfoot. Jack scanned the ground for tracks, anything that might explain what had unsettled Grace. After walking for nearly half an hour, he found something. The snow near a cluster of trees was disturbed, deep impressions, indicating someone or something had been there recently. Among the tracks were large boot prints, the kind a grown man would leave, weaving erratically through the woods. Jack's stomach tightened as he crouched down for a closer look. The boot prints were accompanied by smaller, irregular marks, as if something had been dragged or pulled along. His mind raced. Had someone been out here, looking for Grace and her pups? Or worse, had they left something or someone behind? Jack followed the trail cautiously, his rifle slung over his shoulder. The tracks led deeper into the woods, winding around trees and disappearing into dense undergrowth. He stopped when he noticed a makeshift campsite up ahead, a cluster of rocks arranged around the remnants of a fire. The ashes were cold, but the site looked recently abandoned. As he stepped closer, something shiny caught his eye, a torn leash, frayed at one end, lying half buried in the snow. Jack picked it up, his fingers curling tightly around the worn material. His jaw clenched as he stared at it, anger boiling just beneath the surface. This wasn't just a random encounter. Someone had been here with dogs, and they hadn't cared enough to take them back. His thoughts were interrupted by a sudden rustling behind him. Jack spun around, his grip tightening on the rifle, only to see Grace emerging from the trees. She had followed him, her nose to the ground, her ears alert. Snow and ash were nowhere in sight. She must have left them safely inside the cabin. Grace, Jack said, his voice low but steady. You shouldn't be out here." She ignored him, padding over to the campsite. Her nose twitched as she sniffed the ground, circling the area. Then she froze, her body stiffening, and let out a low growl that made the hair on Jack's neck stand on end. She stared at the trees beyond the campsite, her growl growing louder. Jack turned in the direction she was fixated on, his heart pounding. He couldn't see anything, but Grace's reaction was enough to put him on high alert. "We need to go," Jack said firmly, gripping the leash and tucking it into his pocket. He placed a hand on Grace's back, trying to guide her away. She hesitated, her growl softening but her eyes remaining locked on the distant woods. Back at the cabin, Jack bolted the door and stood at the window, watching the edge of the forest. Grace lay beside him, her pups curled up and unaware of the tension. Jack sighed, his hand brushing Grace's fur. "Whoever was out there isn't going to stop, are they?" he whispered. Grace didn't respond, of course, but her eyes held a knowing look. That night, as the fire crackled and the cabin was wrapped in silence, Jack resolved to be ready for whatever came next. Grace and her pups had fought too hard to survive, and he wasn't about to let their safety be taken from them now. She seemed to fully trust him. Her body relaxed slightly, and she nuzzled his hand, a silent reassurance that they were in this together. Jack sighed, his fingers tracing absent patterns along her fur. The flickering firelight cast shifting shadows on the walls, amplifying the unease that lingered in the air. The night stretched on, quiet but tense. Jack's mind raced, replaying the image of the figure standing at the tree line. There was something chilling about how still they had been, how deliberate. He couldn't shake the feeling that whoever it was wasn't done with them. Grace remained by the door, her gaze unwavering. Snow and Ash, oblivious to the tension, slept soundly on the rug. Their tiny breaths and occasional soft whimpers filled the room, a stark contrast to the dread gnawing at Jack's gut. As dawn approached, Jack made a decision. He wasn't going to wait for the stranger to come back. He needed answers and a plan. Over breakfast, as the pups clumsily played and Grace watched them protectively, Jack began to piece things together. Whoever had abandoned Grace and her pups in the storm had done so for a reason. Maybe they thought she wouldn't survive. But now, someone was watching, and that couldn't be a coincidence. "I need to figure out who's doing this," Jack muttered to himself. Grace tilted her head as if sensing his determination. Later that day, Jack drove into town, his mind set on getting to the bottom of the mystery. His first stop was the local hardware store, where he picked up motion-activated cameras. If someone came back, he wanted evidence. As he paid for the cameras, the store clerk, a friendly man named Ben, raised an eyebrow. "You setting up a wildlife camera?" Ben asked, ringing up the purchase. "Something like that," Jack replied, keeping his tone casual. "Had some strange things happening around the cabin." Ben nodded knowingly. "You're up near the old logging trail, right? That area's been quiet for years, but, folks talk. Sometimes people use those woods for things they shouldn't." Jack's stomach tightened. "Like what?" Ben shrugged, leaning in slightly. "Could be anything. Hunting without permits. Camping where they're not supposed to. Or other things." The implication hung in the air, and Jack left the store more uneasy than ever. Back at the cabin, he set up the cameras along the tree line, making sure to cover the area where the figure had been standing. Grace stayed close by, her nose to the ground, sniffing every inch of the area. Jack couldn't help but notice how alert she was, as if she knew more than she could express. By the time the sun set, the cameras were in place, and Jack felt a flicker of relief. If someone came back, he would know. But as darkness fell, the familiar weight of unease crept back in. That night, Jack sat by the fire, the rifle resting within arm's reach. Grace lay at his feet, her head on her paws, her ears twitching at every faint sound. The pups, exhausted from playing, were curled up together in a tight ball of fur. The room was quiet, except for the crackling fire, but Jack couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone. Hours passed, and just as Jack began to doze off, Grace's low growl jolted him awake. Her body was tense, her eyes locked on the window. Jack followed her gaze, his heart pounding as he saw movement outside. A shadow flitted across the yard, barely visible in the moonlight. Jack grabbed the rifle, his hands steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. "Stay here," he whispered to Grace, though he doubted she would listen. He stepped cautiously to the window, peering through a narrow gap in the curtain. The shadow moved again, this time closer to the cabin. Jack's breath caught as he realized it wasn't just one figure, there were two. Grace growled louder, her body pressed against Jack's legs, ready to defend. Jack steadied himself, his grip tightening on the rifle. He couldn't see their faces, but the way they moved, deliberate and unhurried, sent a shiver down his spine. Without warning, one of the figures raised the flashlight, its beam slicing through the darkness and landing squarely on the cabin. Jack ducked instinctively, his heart hammering. "Who's out there?" he shouted, his voice firm but laced with anger. The flashlight flicked off, plunging the yard back into shadow. For a moment, there was silence. Then, faint footsteps retreated toward the woods, growing softer until they vanished entirely. Jack exhaled shakily, his grip loosening on the rifle. Grace remained by his side, her growls fading, but her body still tense. The rest of the night passed in a restless haze, Jack sitting by the window, his eyes scanning the darkness. He didn't sleep, and when the first rays of sunlight spilled over the horizon, he made another vow. Whoever was out there wasn't just watching, they were planning. And Jack was determined to be ready when they returned. Grace stood her ground, her growl a primal warning that sent a chill through the crisp morning air. Jack kept the rifle steady, his heart pounding as the man hesitated, clearly unnerved by the snarling German shepherd. The man's bravado faltered, his eyes darting between Jack and Grace, weighing his options. "You think you can keep her safe?" The man sneered, his voice unsteady now. "You don't know what she's capable of." Jack's jaw tightened. "I know enough to see she's worth protecting. Now leave before I call the sheriff." For a moment, the man seemed frozen, his grip on the rope tightening. But Grace took a step forward, her body coiled with tension, teeth bared in a display of absolute determination. Her message was clear: if he made another move, she wouldn't hesitate to defend her family. The man raised his hand slightly, palms outward, in a mock gesture of surrender. "Fine," he said, his voice dripping with contempt. "But don't say I didn't warn you." He turned and began to walk away, his boots crunching in the frost. Jack didn't lower the rifle until the man disappeared into the tree line. Even then, he remained on the porch, his eyes scanning the woods for any sign of his return. Grace relaxed slightly, her growl fading, but her posture remained vigilant. Jack knelt down, resting a hand on her head. "Good girl," he murmured, his voice filled with gratitude and pride. "You didn't let him scare you." She licked his hand, a brief but significant gesture of trust, before stepping back into the cabin to check on Snow and Ash, who had begun to stir. Jack followed, closing and locking the door behind him. Inside, the warmth of the fire was a stark contrast to the tension that lingered. Jack poured himself the coffee he had abandoned earlier, his hands trembling slightly as the adrenaline wore off. Grace settled by the pups, licking them gently as if to reassure herself that they were safe. Jack sat heavily in his chair, staring into the flames. The man's words echoed in his mind. "You don't know what you're dealing with." What had he meant? What history did Grace carry that made her such a target? Jack clenched his jaw, his resolve hardening. Whatever trouble lay in her past, it was clear that someone wanted to exploit her again. He wouldn't let that happen. The rest of the day was spent in preparation. Jack adjusted the motion-activated cameras around the property and reinforced the locks on the doors and windows. He even moved a few pieces of furniture to block access to weaker points of the cabin. Grace followed him closely, her eyes sharp and watchful, as if she understood the stakes. By evening, the cabin was as secure as Jack could make it. He sat by the fire again, Grace at his feet, Snow and Ash curled up on a blanket nearby. The pups' playful barks earlier had given way to the soft sighs of contentment as they slept. Jack ran a hand through his hair, exhaustion settling in. "I don't know what your story is," he said softly to Grace, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I promise you this, no one's ever going to hurt you again." Grace raised her head, her amber eyes meeting his. In that moment, Jack felt a bond deeper than words could express. They were in this together, two survivors thrown together by fate. As the fire crackled and the shadows deepened, Jack's resolve grew. Whoever the man was, and whatever he wanted with Grace, he wouldn't succeed. This cabin had become a sanctuary, a place of healing and second chances, and Jack would do whatever it took to keep it that way. The night stretched on, quiet except for the occasional rustle of the wind. Jack sat awake long after the fire died down, his rifle within arm's reach. Grace lay by his side, her presence a silent reminder of the stakes they faced. Together, they kept watch, ready for whatever shadows the woods might send their way. And so, the days at the cabin passed, each one bringing Jack and Grace closer together, their bond growing stronger in the wake of that fateful encounter. The threat of the man returning loomed in the back of Jack's mind, but it was no longer the all-consuming fear it had once been. Grace's bravery and unwavering resolve had shown Jack that they were no longer just surviving, they were thriving. Jack spent his days fortifying the cabin, ensuring it was a fortress against any who might come looking for Grace. He reinforced the doors, installed more cameras, and even built a secure pen outside so Snow and Ash could play safely in the fresh air. Grace watched him work, her amber eyes filled with quiet understanding, as though she knew Jack was doing it all for them. Despite the lingering tension, life at the cabin began to settle into a new rhythm. Snow and Ash grew stronger by the day, their tiny legs carrying them around the cabin with boundless energy. They explored every nook and cranny, their playful barks filling the once quiet home with a joyful noise. Grace, now healthier and more confident, often joined their games, nudging them gently with her nose or pretending to chase them as they tumbled over each other. One crisp morning, Jack stood on the porch, a mug of steaming coffee in hand, as he watched Grace and the pups frolic in the snow. The forest stretched out before him, its beauty unmarred by the dark memories of that night. Grace's tail wagged as she leapt playfully at Snow, who barked excitedly and darted away. Ash followed close behind, his smaller frame struggling to keep up but refusing to be left behind. "You've come a long way, girl," Jack murmured, his voice filled with pride. Grace turned to look at him, her eyes meeting his with a warmth that needed no words. It was a silent acknowledgement of how far they had come together. As the weeks turned into months, the seasons began to change. The snow melted, giving way to the vibrant greens of spring. The cabin, once a place of solitude for Jack, now felt alive with purpose. He found himself looking forward to each new day, not just for the peace of the wilderness, but for the companionship of Grace and her pups. One afternoon, Jack decided it was time to take a walk deeper into the woods to confront the lingering shadows of that man's presence. With Grace at his side and the pups safely in their pen, Jack followed the path to the edge of the forest where the man had stood. The snow had long since melted, but Jack could still picture the scene in his mind, the man's cold smirk, the rope in his hand, and Grace's fierce growl that had sent him retreating. Grace sniffed the ground, her nose to the earth as she searched for any lingering scent. Jack stood silently, his hand resting on the rifle slung over his shoulder, scanning the trees for signs of movement. The woods were still, the only sounds the rustling of leaves and the chirping of birds. Whatever threat had been there was gone now, but Jack knew they couldn't let their guard down entirely. "Come on, Grace," Jack said, giving her a gentle pat. "Let's head back." As they walked toward the cabin, the sunlight streaming through the trees, Jack couldn't help but reflect on how much had changed. Grace had gone from a terrified, emaciated survivor to a confident protector, and Jack himself had found a renewed sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, Jack sat on the porch with Grace by his side. Snow and Ash played nearby, their playful antics, a testament to the life and hope that had taken root in this quiet corner of the world. "You've got a good life here now," Jack said softly, scratching behind Grace's ears. "And I'll do everything I can to keep it that way." Grace leaned into his touch, her tail wagging gently. In her eyes, Jack saw a reflection of his own determination, a promise that together they could face whatever challenges lay ahead. Their story, born out of a storm and shadowed by danger, had become one of resilience and hope. It was a reminder that even in the darkest moments, there is light to be found, and that love and trust can transform lives in the most profound ways. And for Jack, Grace, and her pups, this was only the beginning of their shared journey, a testament to the strength of second chances. The story of Jack and Grace offers a powerful lesson about resilience, trust, and the transformative power of compassion. In life, we often encounter situations where others, be it people or animals, are in desperate need of help. Grace's journey from a storm-battered, terrified mother to a confident, loving protector reminds us that extending kindness, even when it's inconvenient or risky, can change lives, including our own. In today's world, where challenges can often feel overwhelming, it's essential to remember that small acts of care can create ripples of positivity. Whether it's adopting a rescue animal, helping a neighbor in need, or simply offering kindness to a stranger, these moments not only provide relief to others, but also give us a renewed sense of purpose and connection. The story also underscores the importance of standing firm in the face of adversity. Just as Jack protected Grace and her pups from harm, we too must protect what matters to us, be it family, values, or personal goals. In a world filled with uncertainties, building trust and creating safe spaces for ourselves and others can be life-changing. Let this story inspire you to act with courage, embrace compassion, and find strength in the bonds you create. Please rate this story from 1 to 10. We'd love to hear your thoughts, reactions, and suggestions for new stories. Share your opinion and help us make the channel even better.